I'm Chad Martin. I lead the transfer pricing practice here at Eide Bailly. I've also been, for obvious reasons, very heavily involved in our response to the trade and tariff situation for the past few months. The question of the impact of the OBBB-A, if I am getting enough B's in there, is a really interesting one from a transfer pricing perspective. Anyone who knows me knows I live by the mantra, if you squint hard enough, it's all transfer pricing. And it comes through in this bill, because if you do a Control F in the bill text, right, you're not gonna see transfer pricing. You're really not even gonna see tariffs, right? But the concepts underlie, they cast a intercompany specter over what we're seeing in the implications of this bill, especially as it relates to the manufacturing and distribution industry. Look, it's been a really challenging time for our clients that are manufacturers, that are importing products, that are transforming products, even if they have kind of a vertically contained geography in the United States and they don't obviously have a tariff footprint, they're not struggling with those trade wars. So for example, the provisions in the OBBB-A that are essentially strengthening the stick provided by GILTI, right? So in addition to the tariffs, there are now going to be stricter requirements for essentially top-up taxes on companies that have substantial operations, substantial profits in low-tax jurisdictions. I'll use the example of the pharmaceutical industry, right? I'm seeing a lot of differentiation between manufacturers that I might call nimble, right, that can easily scale up or scale down operations, concentrate more activity in the US, and those where that's difficult for financial or technological reasons. The pharmaceutical industry fits the latter category, right? A lot of these have Irish manufacturing and IP ownership arrangements, which are now going to be subject to a higher rate due to the changes to GILTI, or as we're now renaming it in the OBBB-A, which means that they're going to pay a higher top-up tax, up to the 14% in GILTI without the Q-buy exception, right? And they're also going to be hit with the tariffs because anything that is manufactured in Ireland is going to be classified as an import from the US side, right? That gets to another one of the provisions in the OBBB-A that didn't show up, which was Section 899, essentially the retaliatory tax that was meant to strike back against the OECD's project to levy a 15% corporate minimum tax. Section 899 succeeded in bringing the G7 to the negotiating table, essentially allowing the US's minimum tax adjacent provisions to count, right? There is still a long way to go in terms of getting those through domestic legislation in Europe and essentially indemnifying US companies from that Pillar 2 15% global minimum tax. So again, I think what's interesting is what's not necessarily in the bill text itself, but which will incentivize companies in different directions based on how much they can scale, relocate, reconcentrate their operations. So again, returning to this concept of nimble versus maybe non-nimble, less flexible manufacturers, right? Those companies that are able to scale operations in the US, I think might actually see a huge competitive advantage here, right? So looking at transfer pricing, concentration of functions, assets, and risks, to the extent they're able to relocate manufacturing in the US, that's going to obviously benefit them from a tariff perspective and also from an immediate expensing perspective in the manufacturing sphere and the new provisions of the bill. The 174 changes to domestic R&D, right, immediate expensing of those costs, will mean that companies, multinational enterprises that are able to bring some of that R&D from, let's say, a Polish contract software developer or R&D provider to the United States are going to see a huge benefit because they're no longer going to be relying on that 15-year amortization of foreign R&D expenses, because now the changes to 174 providing some alleviation to that. So look, I think a lot of companies are going to see, maybe not so much of a carrot, but less of a stick. The companies that I think are really going to struggle or really going to need to adjust are the ones where, it is not as simple as building a factory, making a $10 billion investment in a US operation, or bringing back R&D that's historically been elsewhere, right? I think those will be the conversations that are going to have to be very intentional, very strategic, and in true keeping with transfer pricing, holistic, right? Looking at your entire business. The one silver lining of this whole, tariffs and then tax reform challenge that we've been presented is that we've really been able to get to know our company, our clients, from a supply chain, from a value chain perspective like we never have before. And I'm really looking to continue those conversations with anyone we're working with in the future.